Ha, gest squext petsia. Ochiet lemti ketsia o kele e. Unech kwam komt gest kayamen suit yet kwa. I've spoken to you today in the Spokane language, which at one time was the dominant language in this region where we currently reside. This is a language that was once the dominant language, but has now come down to a point where it's critically endangered. What exactly does this phrase mean that a language is critically endangered? What that means in practical terms, that unless something is done within the next short while, the language will be gone forever. And in numerical terms, what this means, in the case of the Spokane, is that fewer than 5, maybe 6 fluent speakers remain in all the world. And all of these individuals are over the age of 65. So I want to tell a story today about language and about culture and about a people. And I want to talk a little bit about the process of how a language and culture are lost through the lens of my own personal experience and the experience of my family. When I was a child, 1970s, I used to attend cultural gatherings on the Spokane Indian Reservation in the Spokane Tribal Longhouse. And I remember a time in those days when all the elders would sit around the edges of the room, and there were dozens of them at that time. And it seemed like it would last forever. And I remember these individuals would sit around the edges of the room, and they would converse and tell stories and share the news of the day, and they would speak to each other in the Spokane language. These conversations were lively, filled with laughter. But for some reason, I never understood. When they addressed the younger generation, they would always transition back to English. So as a child, I had this perception that this was something for the older generation, but not something for us, and perhaps something that was going to pass away. At some point, I realized that we've reached this critical point in history, and I've asked myself, how did we get here? And I think this story tells a little piece of that. But to fully understand this question, I think we have to go back in time and examine the lives of the people who went before us. My grandfather was born in 1913, not far from Spokane. Of course, Native Americans did not become citizens of the United States until 1924. And so he was considered a foreigner, even though he was born on American soil. At the time that he was a child, the Spokane language was his first language and the only language spoken in their home. Unfortunately, the United States government did not think too highly of the Spokane language or any other native language for that matter. And so they set up a system of boarding schools that were designed to homogenize Native American youth and turn them into non-Indian and hopefully white people. Many of these children were ripped from their homes against their will and were taken to boarding schools. Many of them were beaten for speaking their languages or for practicing their cultures. Ultimately, my grandfather's generation did survive the boarding school experience, but many of them turned away from their language from that point forward. I heard the stories of my grandfather, and I imagine he had some sense of defiance in the face of assimilation. He used to run away from the school to escape the abuse. And every time he did, the Indian agents would pursue him on horseback and bring him back to school. I imagine that he wanted to keep some semblance of cultural integrity, but eventually it wasn't the boarding schools, but just the economic realities that persuaded him to put his language aside and to marginalize his own culture. In simple terms, he just had to get a job, and for him that meant speaking English. We go forward another generation. My father was born in 1948, and when he was just 5 years old, the United States government enacted a policy of Indian termination. And what this means is that it was the policy of the United States to terminate the special legal relationship between the tribes and the federal government. It was also the policy of the United States that Indians should assimilate into the mainstream culture as quickly as possible and leave behind any vestiges of the past, including the language. It's difficult to really know how much termination as a policy may have affected my father. But I do know that he was the first generation in our family history to speak English as his first language. And so I'm sobered as I reflect upon this to think that I'm only a second generation English speaker. And I never really even connected that until recently as I was preparing for this talk. The second generation. And that quickly we see the decline and the loss. It's difficult to imagine what would be lost if that were to pass away. But I want to tell one more story that illustrates what this point means to me as an individual, but also to many of us as a community who are now, as was mentioned, racing against time to preserve these languages and these ways of life. Again, when I was a child, I used to attend funerals in the Spokane Tribal Longhouse with my father. Sometimes we would show up and I would see other kids would be outside playing. And I'd say, "Dad, I want to go outside and play too." And he'd say, "No, you can't. There's coffee to be poured. There are tables to be served. There are floors to be swept." And so he'd make me, most often against my will, go in and serve coffee, serve food, wash tables, sweep floors. And when all the work was done, he would sit me in the second row behind all the elders. And in those days, the first row were the people who understood and knew the old, what we call now the old Indian hymns. These were hymns that were sung in the Spokane language to pray for the deceased and to pray also for the family of the ones who were grieving. And even though I never understood the words of what they were saying, there was something so powerful about what they were doing. And many times as a boy, 8, 9, 10 years old, I'd sit behind them and weep. I think, what is this that I'm feeling? I don't understand what it is that I'm witnessing, but I knew it was important. And then only 2 or 3 years ago, I was attending another funeral, also on the Spokane Indian Reservation. And I looked around the room, and everyone was speaking English. And I waited for the hymns. And finally, at the end, one man stood up, my father's brother. He stood up by himself in front of that room, the last one standing on that edge, and he sang those hymns, the ones that he knew or could remember. And when I saw him standing there alone, something in my heart broke. And I said to myself, I cannot let him stand there by himself anymore. I will learn the prayers. I will learn the songs. I will learn the stories and the language to the best of my ability, so that as he stands there on that edge, he doesn't have to do it alone. And maybe someone behind me then will hear that and stand with us. I've often heard people speak in TED about a TED wish. But in our culture, everything is framed in the context of spirituality. So for me today, I have a TED prayer. And I'm not sure if that's been done. But this is my TED wish for today in our language. Oyo kulin sutin kela au hlul stuchimasket. And we kuyats lemtam tupia lukayamen sut yet lukwa. O chiats chawi tupia kay kulin sutin who talks ost lukayan quil quelten. Who takexen kleptem lukay pipahut in kulmen tupia lemnam shay. I said, Creator, it's my prayer today that we will never lose our language and will never forget the ways of our elders. Thank you.